All right, hello everyone. Welcome
Oh,
back to
sorry. I thought
uh
you were gonna play the intro music. People
no.
like
People even
because
people like
people
that. People who listen to the podcast will get to hear it.
I like to
You
hear it
can
when we're
listen to
recording.
it whenever you want. It's on YouTube. You can just listen to it
Okay.
24/7 if you want.
Okay, I
You get
will listen to it now.
2 hours here, you can listen to it all the time.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustabia, on fait le bunga, bunga, Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello everyone. Welcome to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. This is, I think, part of a series, a little mini series we're doing called Bunga Has Feelings. So we're going to be talking a little bit about feelings. We're not going to do all that analyzing and criticizing we usually do. We're going to turn inward, tear away those layers of repression like an onion. You may even cry, as you are wont to do when you peel an onion. To help us do this, we of course have a woman who is sensitive and in touch with her feelings. Unlike us, we're basically robots, fleshy, stupid robots, fleshy, stupid, horny robots. But a woman, Nina Power. We are delighted to have her on. She's, if you're not familiar with her, a senior editor and a columnist at Compact. She's the author of What Do Men Want? Masculinity and Its Discontents. So not only does she know what she wants and in touch with her own feelings, she also knows what us fleshy robots want, which is pretty impressive, I have to say. Nina, welcome.
Oh my gosh, thanks.
What do we want, incidentally?
Well, there's a whole list in the book. I asked lots of my male friends, so there is a handy list. So it includes things like a shed and to be left alone and pussy and beer. But then I just ignored all of that instead. So
All right. Well, very good. And of course, I'm Alex Oakley in Sao Paulo, Brazil. This podcast is also George Hoare in London and Philip Cunliffe, I suppose, in Canterbury, England, also, which is a small appendage of London, sort of. It's close enough, whatever.
England is an appendage of London. That's accurate.
No, I got it all wrong. Not as if I lived there for 12 years.
No,
No,
it's
whatever.
accurate.
Yeah, that is true. Well, it's what is it? A housing market with a society attached. I think that still applies. Anyway, to get on to the actual theme of this, we're going to start talking about anger and hatred, and the relationship between each other. I think sometimes they get bound up. They're not exactly the same, but I think it's interesting because as part of this relaunch that Compact Magazine are doing, Nina has written some notes in their new Substack, and just this came out just today, so I thought it was quite appropriate. So I'll just quote from it. I recall my grandfather speaking only infrequently, though kindly when he did. I never remember him complaining. It might be worth experimenting with a return to, if not exactly repression, then at least a dignified attempt to grin and bear it. Complaining simply annoys everyone around you, and it's not clear that it helps solve any of the problems, physical, mental, spiritual, we are naturally heir to. So I thought that was maybe an interesting place to start, Nina, because do we complain too much? I don't mean we on this podcast. Obviously, we complain too much on this podcast, but as a society, to the extent that we can speak of a single society that we live in, do we complain too much, or do we maybe not complain enough? I mean, someone might say, who's trying to be politically radical, say, actually, we don't complain enough. There's all manner of abuses and taking of advantages that go unchallenged. So, you might have the electricity grid privatized, which then raises its prices, even though it promised it wouldn't, things like that. We don't complain enough about those things, surely. So, what do you mean by maybe we should be a little bit more repressed?
yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on here. I would say that my interest in the mood for politics, the best mood for doing politics, goes back quite a long way. And I originally did some research on empathy, which was a term that was becoming quite dominant in sort of activist circles maybe 10 years ago. Um, Obviously open to abuse and critique. We ended up with people sort of asking for payment for emotional labor and kind of really degenerate bastardizations of the social bonds that sort of make us friends and keep us together. And
Sorry, Nina, just to be clear, what was the context in which payment was being demanded for emotional labor?
so I guess okay, so people started talking about emotional labor, which obviously has a long history in kind of left-wing feminist work. Often as a critique, the idea that women are sort of supposed to be there precisely as these emotional support animals and this kind of thing, and that we're supposed to have a better understanding of emotion. I would like to say that I have zero understanding of emotion better than anyone else, and in fact, I've often been accused of being way too rational and masculine for my own good. So I'm speaking only theoretically. I have no emotions either, which is great. But
How does that feel?
well, I don't know.
Yeah.
That
Okay.
was your joke.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. It wasn't. I mean, was it a joke? Not really. You gave it the response it deserved. To be fair.
Can save that one for George's gist. The section we'll be introducing next month by listener demand.
George's jizz. That doesn't sound very
It doesn't sound great, but
healthy.
it's a
No,
listener's
it
fault.
doesn't. But it's the listeners. The listeners want it, so we're going to give them George's gist.
It's important to spell it GIST, and it's about me summarizing episodes for the executive listener who only has 10 seconds to listen to an episode.
I can't believe that's a thing. Is this the sort of TikTokification of everything?
It's what they're trying to get me to do. We'll see.
That's weird. Okay. Anyway, sorry, there's a lot going on here. So emotional labor, it became a kind of common currency, but I think what people understood by that was, well, because it's work, because it's labor, it must be paid. And because there's this feminist critique of, women in particular being sort of used and abused for their listening and soothing and sympathetic, hypothetically, that we could also monetize these things, and that would be a form of class revenge or something like that. I don't know. It was absolutely crazy. So you ended up with situations where people were saying, okay, I could listen to you moan for an hour, but then you have to Venmo me £20. So people were sort of setting themselves up as kind of fake therapists, but it reveals a real need and a desire, obviously, for communication. So like every time we're talking about these things, we're looking at them symptomatically and trying to understand the deeper social meaning of them. So I started off being really interested in empathy. I was obviously very active on the left, particularly around the student movement, and a lot of what happened, it happened to me as well, was burnout and extreme forms of feelings of injustice and anger. And I was going out with Alfie, who was nearly killed by the police, and then he was on trial for 4 years. And obviously, this caused, as it would do, enormous amounts of very painful feelings. Feelings of desire for revenge against the police, against the state, desire to protect Alfie, who was sort of not only physically but also like legally going through this hell and possibly going to prison. I mean, it was just so obviously unjust, and it creates this sort of white hot burning feeling. It's very, very unpleasant, and I could see this in a lot of people politically, and it goes back to, I think, the original point that Alex was making about, well, aren't there loads of things to feel angry about? And the answer is yes, but anger and the desire for revenge, it ultimately struck me, is not the right mood for doing politics in necessarily. I suppose. Let me caveat that. The feeling of injustice and the feeling of outrage, absolutely, but ultimately those feelings can destroy you, and they nearly destroyed me. I nearly died. Like lots of people had serious burnout around the student movement. That part of the London left, whatever, kind of turned inwards, and lots of people really struggling with addiction, bad mental health, and we lost every struggle for sort of years on end, and we didn't really have a very good way of dealing with it.
Could you maybe just say a bit more about that? Because I'd be curious to hear. I mean, obviously yourself and Alfie were in a very particular position, given Alfie being assaulted by the police and everything, and then being accused of assaulting the police, and that leading to the 4-year court case and so on. But I mean, presumably that was exceptional for the student, for the kind of the fees, anti-fees student left. I mean, so I'm just curious, I suppose, about, was it or maybe I'm wrong about that, and maybe kind of instances of being brutalized by the police are much more common. But I'm curious as to kind of led to this burnout being so common, even among people who presumably weren't, so kind of at the sharp end of the state in the way that Alfie and yourself were.
Well, I think actually a lot of people did have an experience at those protests of various quite shocking forms of police behaviour, like horses were charging into crowds, and quite a lot of people were actually hit by batons. I mean, it got very violent, particularly on the 9th of December 2010. People were kettled multiply. I think if you've never had an experience of that kind of crowd control, I mean, if you're a working class football fan and that kind of thing, you probably have. But if you're a middle class student who's like 16 or 18, and this is your sort of experience of maybe one of your first protests, and you're
Yeah,
really quite
yeah.
scared. I think it did actually have a very powerful effect on quite a lot of people who were there or who saw the footage. Obviously, we had the riots 6 months later, 2011. That was very interesting, and the kind of connection between the student protests and the riots I find a fascinating question to pose. I don't necessarily have an answer, but I do think there is a connection. I think a lot of people were also in occupation in 2009, actually around Gaza, but then it turned into occupations around the closure of departments. So Middlesex philosophy, that's where Alfie kind of got involved, and I studied there as well. And so I think there were lots of material experiential situations that people had of occupying, working together, being on protest. It was sort of more embodied and more physical than we might imagine or might remember, even. And certainly because we lost the fees battle, right? It was a very actually selfless mode of protest, because we were campaigning on behalf of people to come. Do you know what I mean? Most of the people there had been paying lesser fees, or I was literally the last cohort that didn't pay fees at all to go to university. And that completely has transformed. That difference between going to university for free and paying fees has totally transformed, as we saw and as everyone predicted exactly what would happen: the commodification of education, the turning of a degree into a product, the inability to have really any critical kind of discussions at university anymore, and all of the things we said would happen happened. And so I think everyone was extremely disheartened about that failure. And then there were kind of loads of others, and it just became miserable.
I mean, it
So
does
was
occur to
it
me that
just
that it might be something of youth to be angry on behalf of something a little bit more sort of impersonal, or if not impersonal, not related to you. That it's or to put it in the opposite way, that kind of with the progress of age, people tend to become a little bit more focus on their own circle, their own family, defending what they have, their family life, for example, and getting very angry about things that breach that, and have less time and less political passion and anger for other people. So, the case of students, it was like I was involved in those student protests as well, and you're protesting on behalf of future generations of students, not your own. You were fine. You actually, I paid some, but not very much. So I wonder if there's like a kind of not necessarily generational, but kind of passing through life, a life stage element to this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a kind of cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason. I think that people perhaps do become more I don't know, acquiescent, more accepting of the reality as they find it proximate to them, and these kind of ideals go by the wayside. I suppose, just to go back to the emotion point, it really did strike me that this kind of anger that we had, and our inability to deal with kind of failure and the subsequent turning inwards and attacking each other, and kind of destroying forms of solidarity. You could say, well, these were weak bonds anyway. Like, these were bonds that were forged not necessarily out of a class position exactly, or in the usual way we might historically understand solidarity. But really, they were sort of temporary, and maybe a symptom of youth in a way. I mean, I was older than a lot of people in the student process, because I already had a lectureship by the time the fees stuff happened. But I'd only just graduated and got my PhD. So, yeah.
I suppose, two follow-up questions. One is, do you think there was anything more about the kind of the climate of the time, the kind of politically with the government, perhaps, or with the aftermath of the financial crash. I'm just curious if that those kinds of contextual factors also fed into the atmosphere that you describe, the kind of emotional, the turning inward and the emotional kind of responses you've described. But also, how important was that experience to your kind of your political journey? Because I understand that you kind of see yourself as someone who's departed the left since then.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good first question. I think you're right that it's actually a very important feature of this, that it was indeed just after the financial crash, and that our enemies, as it were the state, were the government. It was the Tories, it was the police, it was the state, it was the law courts, it was everyone who was trying to push through the fees vote. And in that sense, we were precisely opposed to, you know, state and forces of oppression as we saw them. And this gave us like a common enemy, but it was an enemy upwards, right? It wasn't a horizontal enemy or a downward enemy, as it were. And that was a very unifying force, because it was very obvious that the imposition of austerity and the cuts to public libraries, universities, and so on were all part and parcel of the same project to immiserate and to blame people for the economic crisis, whose fault it precisely was not. The bailing out of the banks was in recent memory, and so on. Yeah, so so that's contextually really important. You're completely right to bring that up. It feels very different now, even though we still have a Tory government and many of the same, horrible neoliberal policies, and however we'd like to describe it. In terms of my political journey, I think I felt around 2013, 2014 that something was going quite badly wrong, at least in some of the kind of activist and lefty circles I was moving in. And it was partly to do with the transition online, where people were started attacking each other in person, not in person, as it were, like denouncing each other and me tooing each other. It was a little bit before Me Too, but people were still kind of doing that kind of thing, accusing people of being abusive and whatever. Because I think this turn in was because of the failure, like the classic kind of how do you shore up the in group? Well, you create enemies, you throw them out. Oh, we can be unified against that guy. Basic, social anthropological stuff. And I saw this stuff happening, and I found it really horrifying. And I was trying to say to people, look, we need to have these conversations offline. Like, we need to speak in person. Most people are trying to do their best. In fact, we all are. Like, we're not the enemy of each other. But I think when you start to analyze the mechanism, and you start to say, well, this person is being cut off unfairly, and there's no equivalent of due process. I mean, people started talking about accountability, but accountability never really happened. And if it did, it was sort of terrifying by all accounts. It was literally people just sort of shouting at someone in a room, and them going like, oh, and then them saying, the group saying, well, that's not an apology. And even where people apologized, people would say, well, that's not a real apology. And so it was, this post-Christian culture where there's literally no forgiveness, no possibility of atonement or forgiveness, or any understanding that we're all capable of harm, and we're all broken, and we shouldn't set ourselves up in judgment and too much, if you see what I mean. Like, we're not in a superior pure position of judgment. And
Yeah.
it just got really, really nasty.
You
And
say post-Christian, but you think it's that kind of, rather than I don't know, a kind of a recreated kind of Maoist dynamic in far left activist circles.
I think it's complicated, but yeah, there was that sense of the what do you call it, the struggle session, where you can't actually defend yourself ultimately, because it's not about that, it's about the scapegoat. But I think it's weird, because a lot of this stuff is always being done in the name of the victim, which we would say is a sort of maybe Christian inheritance, but speaking on behalf of others, which is really terrible thing to do. But lots of people were trying to do that, saying you're offending this hypothetical group or this person, whatever. And I think the moment you identify the mechanism, then the mechanism will come for you. And that's exactly what happened. And I sort of knew it was coming. I could feel it coming. And I was like, well, okay, I might as well be cancelled horribly. And I was. repeatedly, but especially in 2018 when I was a member of the Labour Party and I posted something because I'd read the interrogations of some of the female members of the party that had been leaked, and they were saying, can we have a democratic discussion about the proposed changes to the Gender Recognition Act? And they were basically being suspended and shouted at, and in these private conversations with other members of the Labour Party, and then expelled from the party. And I just thought, this is really wrong. Even if and I didn't necessarily even agree or have that much understanding of what the issues were at that point, but I just thought, this is not how to conduct, this is not how people who are ostensibly on the same side should be speaking to each other.
Yeah.
Or indeed, even people who are politically serious should speak to each other, which maybe
Right.
seems counterintuitive because you think, your anger is a testament to your seriousness and commitment. But I think often it isn't. It runs the other way. And I mean, you said earlier something about, anger and particularly vengeance is probably not a good way to do politics. I think a lot of it, particularly with regard to vengeance, there's a lot of, particularly if I'm being critical of left wing politics, is that it's very eatable in that regard. I mean, it's like "fuck you, dad" politics, um, and often by people who are far too old to be engaging in that kind of thing. I get it if teenagers do that; that's what you're going to do. But what I wonder is, there's a whole discussion about kind of the repression of emotion and political passions through the whole end of history period. I mean, a discussion we in our own small way participated in as well. But I mean, especially thinkers that we have looked up to, like Wolfgang Streeck or Slavoj Žižek, have looked at the way at that post politics, or the kind of foreclosure of political contestation, comes accompanied, or rather involves a sort of repression of politics, and that repression then kind of fails at a certain point. Politics bursts back, but there's like an effective level to that, I think, which is really important too, right? That like the repression is not just of saying, hey, you can't do that, or give us our due. It's also a repression of kind of emotions like anger and even hatred of those who have wronged you. And I wonder whether that's changed or even come full circle, like whether now there's a kind of politics actually is overly ridden with emotion in a way that it was kind of a little bit bereft of it and kind of a bit bloodless for 20, 30 years.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I've just been reading quite a lot of this very strange Polish book called Political Ponerology. I don't know. I think I maybe mentioned it to one of you before.
Yeah.
By
We'll come on to that in, I guess, a little bit more depth in just a bit, but
Yeah,
yeah, go on.
well, he talks about the way in which societies can become hysterical, like they can become over emotional, and I wonder if that's to some extent what's happened. And again, it maybe in the first place had good intentions. Like, why shouldn't we express our anger? Why shouldn't we be sad if we're sad? Why shouldn't we feel all these things and talk about them and have this kind of therapeutic culture? But there are kind of downsides to that too. Not least the kind of therapization of everything, and it, I suppose, if we say that sort of therapy has maybe replaced some of the kind of functions that religion played, or Christianity in particular played, then we have to ask which specific modes, which specific affects and which specific moods and modes have shifted or been eliminated. So just to go back to the point I was trying to make about a kind of post-Christian, strange fusion of some Christian ideas: equality, victimhood, universality, sort of, um, not internationalism, but whatever, some kind of humanism, but at the same time without this idea of like forgiveness and atonement. And it struck me that when I was thinking back about the 90s and the kind of people on the socialist left that I was encountering, or people who are into raves and so on, that there was much more room for making mistakes, whether it was like politically, conceptually, or personally, as we all do. And that there was a kind of humor and openness to other people being human, which is to say fallible. I'm not saying excusing terrible behavior, but I mean in the sense that, like, we all make mistakes and we're all capable of harm. And I think that idea got kind of translated into, no, there are some people who cause harm and there are some people who are victims. And that's very, very, very dangerous, especially when we start tying those things to groups by identity definitions, right? And we say, oh, this group are always a victim, and these people are always an oppressor, right? This is very, very dangerous, precisely because this question of hatred then comes in, and then you say, well, we're allowed to hate the people who hate, right? So if we say there's a group over there who are somehow filled with hatred, we don't know why, they just are, right? We can call them, I don't know, racists or xenophobes or whatever, but we're allowed to do whatever we like to them. Do you see
Yeah.
what I mean?
But I think Scotland even has a minister for victims, which I
Oh
was
wow.
shocked to discover. I think Scotland, as particularly Phil and George have pointed out many times on this podcast, maybe one of the most advanced places in terms of the institutionalization of woke, for lack of a better word, I guess. But yeah, I mean that I think if you're in doubt as to how much victim culture has become institutionalized and has become even part of a mode of rule, I think that is good testament to it. That one would have a minister for victims, and it's not even, from what I can tell, because I think it's also ministers for victims and community safety or something like that. I mean, a really sort of Orwellian job title, and it's not even just something which is like an appendage of the Home Office or the Interior Minister or Justice Minister rather, where it's purely concerned with the courts and like the victims of crime, which already be maybe a little bit sort of insidious, but it really is just presumably directed at society in general and all those who might be victims.
I just wanted, just before we get more into that, Nina, I just wanted to loop back to your describing your exile from the left over these kind of these internal disputes within the Labour Party. So, why did you? I suppose what made you decide abandonment was what you had to do rather than, I don't know, like holding on for something better, or trying to kind of set out like this is what the left should be about. You people are not about this. I'm just curious, I suppose, about your the specific maneuvers and responses to the challenge you confronted at that point.
Yeah, I mean, insofar as it matters, and I'm not sure it does at the individual level so much, but I mean, I would say I still have quite a lot of leftist positions. They just might not look particularly leftist at this point because they're probably more to do with, how to put it, certain forms of preservationism, certain forms of localism, certain forms of defending communities and families against the state, right? So kind of a Lashian leftism in some ways, in concern with limits to growth, concern with technology, critical of it. I'm very Illichian. I'm very influenced by Ivan Illich, and I it's difficult because part of this is theoretical, part of it is contextual, and it felt to me that the left I was a part of, in inverted commas, in London was not necessarily the left. It was something that had gone badly wrong, and the Labour Party were not representing Labour, and they certainly weren't behaving in a democratic way. And I suppose I'd been feeling increasingly uneasy with the personal way people were treating each other, and then specifically the way women were being treated. And one of my tipping points was actually seeing a video of Helen Steele, who was a hero to the left, for standing up against McDonald's and challenging corporate power. And she's a very wonderful woman, and she had been a victim of spy cops. She'd really been targeted by the state. And anybody on the anarchist left or the Labour left felt that Helen Steele was this great figure, and I did too. And she started asking questions in a very like open-minded way about some of the stuff around gender, and she got absolutely smashed. And I just couldn't believe it. I just thought,
Yeah.
what, you're gonna give up on this woman because of this, like as if you're gonna forget everything else that she's done and what she represents. And
Yeah.
I was just shocked, and that was happening a lot to a lot of women I respected, and I sort of couldn't live with the cognitive dissonance anymore. And I thought there's something really wrong here.
Yeah, it does seem to speak to and a kind of culture wars alignment that is demanded of people, where you need to have every, you go down through the columns, like views on this, views on that, views on cultural consumption, TV they prefer, whatever, and then you need to have the correct selection from each one. And so this forms a person which is like this, and it has those attributes, and someone on the other side has the opposing attributes, but you can have no kind of heterogeneity in your kind of composition.
Right.
And you're allowed to hate the person then who doesn't kind of completely who doesn't fit the model of what you're supposed to be. So it's actually incredibly conformist, actually. The more I think about it.
Oh, completely. So I think basically a lot of people in reality have views from across the political spectrum. Not necessarily a wide range, but they definitely would have views that are more leftist. Maybe they're redistributionists. Maybe they're interested in high taxation. But maybe they're a social conservative. Maybe they go to church and they want more families. Or, do you know what I mean? Like, in reality, people actually are not straightforwardly left or right. I think most people have a heterodox collection of positions. And I think when I came across this sort of diagnosis of post liberalism and the idea that actually we need to give up on this French revolutionary division between left and right and think differently about what politics is, I was quite struck by that as a diagnosis. And then also the kind of question about what comes after. I mean, it's a question you're obviously very interested in, given the whole premise of your whole podcast.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, I just wanted to move things on maybe a little bit from the British left to evil, if there is uh, distance there. Yeah, because this is one of the things that we did want to discuss, and I guess why is evil interesting? Why is this you referenced this book, political, and this is not a word I'm familiar with, ponerology. But yeah, but I guess more than the psychological perspective that book takes, that we'll get onto. Why is this an interesting question in general, like from a theological or historical perspective?
Yeah, I think I'm always interested in concepts that people want to say are not interesting or passe or
Hmm.
irrelevant or wrong, right? So, for example, nature would be one of these. Essentialism is literally like the worst thing you can be is an essentialist. Evil, oh no, well, that's just a sort of ridiculous old-fashioned way of talking about things, and we've got explanations for everything now. And you have this weird fusion when it comes to evil of a certain kind of Nietzschean critique of evil. Oh, that's something that weak people project, but with a sort of liberal denial of evil, right? Which is to say, oh no, there's just this kind of pluralism and everyone has different beliefs, and maybe we occasionally need to
Hmm.
punish people, but there's no such thing as evil doesn't exist. And so I'm quite interested in these sorts of things, and I've had encounters that I might describe, that I can only, well, I can't describe them, and I suppose I'm interested in those questions of like the indescribable. And I think that politics, yeah, quite rightly, is in a sort of modernist enlightenment mode, and we think that we can either sort of rationalize everything or um yeah, give an explanation. And I think there are certain things even in this modern world that we can't straightforwardly give an explanation for.
Could you give us an example, if you don't mind talking about one of the experiences, or
I
something which isn't kind of experiential, just in terms of something which doesn't fit? Because it seems to me like, if you're right, it's a tremendous challenge to the belief that politics can actually address the problems of the world, because that is the great premise of the Enlightenment, that politics, that the ills that afflict us can be collectively resolved
Mm.
by the right ideas, the right institutions, the right policies, the right kind of government, and what have you.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that sense, I think the longer tradition, the older traditions, the ones that have just survived barely, Christianity would be the obvious one. And Christianity and liberalism are not indissociable. I mean, Christianity is very influential on liberalism. I mean, just because you get rid of God, it doesn't mean you get rid of Christian values. You might get rid of some of them, like forgiveness, but they come from that history. We have to be sort of materialist about ideas and the way they translate through time, even if bits of them are lopped off. And so I think politics cannot explain everything, right? I agree. Well, you weren't saying this, but the premise of the Enlightenment, we can shine a light on everything, and we can get clarity, and we can give a causal explanation. I would say in an encounter, okay, to go back to this question of maybe hatred, right? Like, I've been very hated. Like, I know I'm very hated by a lot of people, and it's very, very weird. It's a very, very strange experience to be hated by a lot of people and to feel hate, or read about being hate. How awful you are, what a terrible person you are, and
Especially when you think you're doing good, right?
well,
I mean, if you think if you're
I
being
don't
provocative or
necessarily.
whatever, like, well, okay, people are gonna hate me for this.
Right, and I don't straightforwardly think that I'm doing good. I think, like everybody, I've probably done good things and bad things, and I definitely done things I think were good for other people and so on, but also done incredibly stupid things and so on, and that's completely normal. But so to try to understand, I suppose, that affect or emotion that's coming from other people, and to understand that they feel betrayed or something like this or whatever, and that they're sort of channeling something, and in the context also of the kind of expansion of hate speech legislation and the kind of curbing of various claims, even where they appear to be factually true, they might be understood to be offensive at the subjective, and changing hate speech from being an objective criterion to being a subjective one. This is a very dangerous move. But yeah, I suppose, gosh, where was I going with this? The remind me of the last point. It was
So
really
I
good.
mean, I'll put it this way, actually, and to
Mhm.
kind of set this up a little bit more. It
Yeah.
strikes me that we were talking about anger and about hatred, and you can see how those two things are connected, even if they're not the same. But it's also, evil is a question which isn't very discussed today, I think. And I'm not a theologically minded person, so it's not a question that I've particularly pondered in my life, I have to admit. But it does seem to me that hatred is held up as, particularly in liberal society, though increasingly I think everywhere, as the right comes to kind of reflect back the same stuff that kind of woke liberalism does, but in reverse, that hatred is held up as the prime evil, indeed, in our society.
Mhm.
And I've been kind of perplexed by that, because it seems not to explain very much. It even kind of verges on being a redundancy, perhaps. Or maybe it just completely misses the mark, because evil is something which is impersonal. Maybe there are kind of grand evils that happen which are not a reflection of the fact that someone hated someone else, that there were interpersonal frictions, which seems to me be perhaps by the by. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we would generally differentiate between sort of natural evil and moral evil. So natural evil, like bad things happening to good people, and we don't really have an explanation, like why did this earthquake like kill loads of perfectly nice people or whatever. Or so I guess I'm more focused on the question of moral evil, or human evil, as it were, like the ways in which we behave towards one another. And I suppose just to try to link the question of hatred to the question of evil, it strikes me that one way of thinking about evil, whether we look at René Girard, who's actually become very popular and very useful for a lot of people to try to understand various anthropological mechanisms around groups and desire and envy, rivalry, competition, scapegoating, and um, yeah, and also denunciation, because Girard links Satan to the denouncer, right? So Satan is the force. It's a process. I mean, Satan isn't a character. Satan is not this little black drawing, despite the history of representation, the history of art, but rather a process in which denunciation occurs. As somebody is presented as a problem for the group, whether they are or not, they become the focus of hatred, and then the sacrifice, one way or another, of this person then seeks to get the group back together again, because they're unified against a common enemy, and so on. And so I suppose I came to understand, at least had a rough definition of evil being, in a way, not talking to somebody, which doesn't sound like a good definition of evil at all. Certainly not a historical one, but rather a sort of refusal um to to deal with the other. Right? It's much easier to say,
Mm.
go away, like, we hate you, you're ostracized, you're never going to work again, like you're a bad person, rather than listen to what the person has to say or to disagree with them, or and we've seen this happen a lot to a lot of people, right? It's been a very common and dominant mode of social behavior, or antisocial behavior, you could say, which is simply to cut people off because they
Yeah.
disagree on vaccines or Brexit or gender or whatever.
I mean, I guess you can see two reasons why you would want to do that to kind of the evil person. And the first is that, and I think this is how evil often functions as this kind of psychological concept. If you can't explain something like child killings, like this is human evil, like you can't, there's no point talking to them because they're not human, or you're not going to get anything out of it. And the second is maybe that it's like it could spread somehow.
Mm.
This is actually dangerous. Like you have to be careful of evil because it can kind of, it can be contagious. I mean, why that would be the case, you can kind of dig into that. But this is kind of, as far as I understand it, this essentially one of the arguments in this book, Political Ponerology, is that, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this. And you kind of referred to it before as this strange Polish psychologist had written this book, and I think that's probably quite a good summary, a good gist, if you will. That essentially totalitarianism comes from, you have this small evil group of psychopaths, and then it spreads, it diffuses. You have these spellbinders, and you have these kind of, I don't know, it spreads like a virus throughout the whole body politic. So is this a kind of a theory then, to kind of bring it back to what we were talking about before, of like the dangers of letting small groups of evil people interact with other people in a society?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a problem in the presentation of the idea of pathocracy, or because it seems too reductive, or it's a difficult idea to swallow, and we wouldn't, because the problem is, once we start saying, oh, there's a small group of evil people and we can blame them, then you end up back in the same situation, right? Precisely the situation that you're trying to describe rather than invoke and then act upon, right? So I think Lobachevsky, the author of this book, who's a kind of Polish dissident who's writing under a communist regime in the 1980s, but he's trying to look at the underlying features of societies that have gone wrong, let's say, regardless of their
Right.
supposed political, and maybe a more serious way of putting it would be like, why do bad ideas take hold, right? It goes back to this point in mimesis and contagion, right? Why can you convince certain historical moments people to do terrible things,
Yeah.
or to believe things that are manifestly not true? And we could talk about this in a post-truth age. We have a kind of battle, as always, for status and for power, and often politics just starts to look like a kind of a battleground without any commitment to truth or anything like that. Like it's just people competing for power. And as a philosopher, I'm loyal to philosophy, and I have to think that there's something outside of politics, and I have to be committed to truth, and so I suppose it's an attempt to explain at a deep level why bad ideas take hold. We don't necessarily have to sort of reduce it to psychopaths. I
Mm.
think this is kind of, but it's interesting to think about how that does function as an operative theory. Also for people trying to understand the world, right? We've seen various claims about sort of elite paedophilia, and these sorts of claims are like both true and not true exactly in the way that they're presented, right? And obviously a Marxist critique of these sorts of supposed conspiracy theories would be to say something like, this doesn't take into account any of the materialist and economic dimensions and the questions of political struggle, but rather seeks to give an idealist almost explanation for, oh, there's some evil over there and that's why everything bad is happening, right? And that's a very dangerous sort of way of thinking. um, Nevertheless, I have definitely encountered people who do not seem to have the same theory of mind, the working folk psychological theory of mind, which is basically that other people are like fundamentally trying to do their best, and that we can, if we disagree, we could probably talk about it, and um, people make mistakes, and that kind of
Mm.
thing. A little bit of social forgiveness and flexibility. I've definitely encountered and been very, very targeted by people who do not hold that same theory of of mind,
Mm.
or social psychology. And I suppose part of this is just an attempt, very naively and earnestly, to try to understand what happened to me and to many other people in the last 10 or so years. So
Mm.
of course
Yeah.
I'm personally motivated, but I don't want to remain in a sad or reactive position. I want to understand. In this sense, I'm an enlightenment person, right?
Actually, I was just going to say, I mean, to kind of piggyback on Phil's question earlier, it would seem to me that it would be a serious indication of degeneration politically if we were increasingly holding people to be kind of fundamentally evil or to be possessed by kind of evil drives, and that would explain the world. That would seem to me a real regression vis-a-vis any sort of enlightenment idea of what it means to kind of be human, be sociable and social, and kind of in some way try to get along and improve the world. That there might be a premise of, and even a materialist understanding that, the bad people aren't doing bad things because they're bad, but because that's their position in society and they're just following their interest. And that interest, indeed, can be kind of denuded of any sort of mythological kind of, or I don't know if mythological is the right way to put it, but some kind of metaphysical element, and that interests are just kind of naked and simple and okay, right? And you might say them narrowly following their self-interest, okay, there's more to life than that, but we understand that. We can reckon with that and oppose it perhaps, or go along with that interest, or try to channel that self-interest into a greater collective self-interest, or whatever it might be. And if we're not able to see interest anymore, and that it becomes just a reduced down to some evil drive or something kind of unfathomable, that would seem to be a real regression. And I wonder, like, I'm just thinking of like areas of life where I've witnessed that, because you mentioned, Nina, like, you encounter people who don't have the same kind of folk philosophy of mind or whatever, and I'm like, well, I guess I would encounter that, I mean, amongst kind of religious fundamentalists. I mean, here, like evangelical Christians in Brazil very often, even if on a interpersonal basis, very personable and nice and whatever, have a notion that there's evil, there's the devil around the corner, and that people are acting for very deeply evil reasons, and you can't reckon with them. And indeed, also the kind of woke left, also in some ways as well, that there's kind of yeah, that people are driven by evil, or indeed the kind of vulgar Marxism, which kind of always floats around here and there, of, the capitalists are bad because they're bad people, and they
Mm-hmm.
fundamentally want to eat babies and whatever it might be.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of murky waters, undoubtedly, all of this stuff, because precisely the trap you don't want to fall into is the trap you're trying to diagnose, right? You're trying to understand. Um, but
Right. No, I'm not saying like those people are bad because they they think
no,
about
no, no.
evil and therefore, yeah.
But I'm talking about myself, I suppose, in the sense of like turning to evil, when precisely it's one of those things that has been put to one side because it seems to lead to these kinds of demonizations, right? Because you end up wanting to place it somewhere other than yourself, right? And
Mm,
I'm enough of a sort of psychoanalytic thinker to um, and I think that psychoanalysis is in some ways compatible with certain parts of Christianity, which is to say our fundamental lack, our fundamental brokenness, the fact that we are a combination of active and passive, masculine and feminine, and so on. And the same would go for our capacity to do harm and to be harmed, right? And somehow these sort of really basic observations that you get in all kinds of different modes of thinking seem to have been forgotten, and there's a form of solidarity which I think is an understanding of what it is to be human that includes everybody. It can't. I know this comes into tension with things like class antagonism, and I've always really hated that kind of vulgar Marxism, which simply demonizes capitalists and makes it and personifies um in that way, like it. So we
mm,
both need to sort of maintain a kind of structural analysis, institutional analysis, and so on. But I think one of the things that the parts of the left that I was involved in maybe failed to do was to also have an understanding of something like individual choice or conscience, and this had bad consequences for people who are suffering from addictions or people who are in trouble, because everything was just blamed on capitalism. You know what I mean? It's like, oh well, this person's like miserable and drinking too much and taking drugs, and well, that's just capitalism, isn't it? There was no sense of like, well, actually this person can make decisions and we can help them to get out of this obviously objectively bad state. And so there's something defeatist about the structural. If it's only structural, do you know what I mean? You just blame the
Yeah.
system.
Well, as
I
I like to
wanted.
say, structure in the streets, agency in the sheets. That's my motto.
Sure.
Don't encourage him, Nina.
Don't encourage him.
Yeah. I had a quick. So I suppose I had a quick follow up question, and then a more maybe a more complicated one. But the first one is, excuse me. The first one is, should we not hate our enemies then?
Well, not if you're Christian. And I think that you don't have to be Christian. I'm not saying that therefore the Christians are right, but I think we have to understand why Christianity worked out that this was not necessarily the correct thing to do, even when one is opposing injustice, or especially when one is opposing injustice. Partly
And
because,
what is what is the
yeah,
Christian answer?
well, I mean, you're supposed to love your enemies, right? Um, the reason, well, I think that you are supposed to love your enemies is to understand that they are not as distant from you as you might want them to be, that you are also your friend and your enemy as well. And like when you say love your neighbor as thyself, right? It's also to say there is nothing really that separates you from your neighbor. You're not special. You're not different in some ways. Everybody has a soul. Everybody has conscience. Everybody has the capacity to decide what to do. The Christian solution to the problem of the violent spiral, to turn the other cheek, is a way of ending, right, mimetic rivalry, as Girard would put it. It's pretty much the only way you could say that Christianity worked out how to stop vengeance, right? How to stop the inevitable retribution.
And would you kind of would you take this politically, like down the direction of Gandhian nonviolence and that kind of thing? Would that be the kind of the political conclusion for you, or is it simply to understand the rationale for kind of short circuiting, like you say, these kind of violent spirals?
I think first and foremost, the second point, I think that we have to understand the Christian solution, as it were, in inverted commas, as a historical and social innovation, right? That it came at a certain point, that it was responding to certain material conditions, that it has a great profundity and a great wisdom to it. Also, in our personal lives, to not escalate things and whatever. But it doesn't. I don't think Christianity is fundamentally a kind of a form of passivity or passivism, in the sense that Nietzsche attacks it for it, and he conflates Christianity with democracy and feminism and science and anything that has this other an idea of another world or democracy or flattening out, this aristocratic critique of everything that has a sort of egalitarian dimension, whether it's equal before God or equal in the political sphere, in the democratic ideal. So I I don't think Christianity says that we shouldn't hate lies, for example. We shouldn't hate sin. I don't think it says that we can escape hate actually. And this is one of the things I kind of want to defend about hatred, is to say it's actually a necessary feature of our development. Freud says this: hatred comes before love and is not opposed to it. Because if you think about those developmental stages where the child is pushing his or her parent away and saying "I hate you, mummy," or being violent towards toy, it's a necessary stage, just like primary egotism, where you're saying I'm not that. So that role of negation in the formation of any healthy character is necessary, right? It is necessary that we hate. And the criminalization of hate, particularly for people expressing opinions, whether they be religious or scientific or bad opinions, whatever, like annoying opinions, is very, very, very dangerous. And I think calling things hatred when they're not, but then at the same time I also want to say we must defend the right to hate as well. So it's not an elimination of hatred, but rather avoiding its misplacement or its misconception by the state. When the state starts telling you what hate is, that's when you have to run. Like
Yeah,
that's
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I had my more kind of complicated follow up or kind of a sidestep was, so I know very little about very little is exaggerating about Girard, but my kind of thoughts about evil were very much shaped by Hannah Arendt's point about the banality of evil, and um, and despite the fact that I think it's been kind of it's been and I wonder if this is actually part of what you describe, because what's interesting to me is that her insight seems to have been occluded. Kind of since she wrote the piece Eichmann in Jerusalem, there's been much more kind of criticism and pointing out that Eichmann was, kind of historical and biographical criticism, pointing out that Eichmann was in fact very ideologically committed anti-Semite. He wasn't just a kind of a kind of a simple-minded bureaucrat. And so there's been, it seems to me, like a concerted effort to repress that kind of greater Entian insight about evil being something which is profoundly banal. Which is to say, not kind of, it seemed to me like she was kind of struggling against the theological idea of evil, as something which is so kind of awesome and overwhelming that it can only be attributed to some providential agency or some kind of divine plan which is remote and opaque to us. And so it kind of gives evil this, it endows evil with this kind of tragic grandeur, and this kind of glamour. And so her kind of claims about the banality of evil were to deflate it essentially, and to take away its kind of grandeur. And that seemed to me tremendously kind of important. And it seems again kind of important to me that that kind of insight seems to be occluded. Anyway, I suppose I wanted, because this is territory I'm not familiar with, so I wanted your thoughts about that. But also if there's any kind of relationship between the Arendtian model of evil, if I've portrayed it justly, and the Girardian kind of account that you've sketched out for us.
Yeah, I mean, just on the first point, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because on the one hand, we might think of evil as being historically passe, theological, and so on. But on the other hand, it's very clear that in reality, liberal post war politics has increasingly operated with a transcendent notion of political evil, which shapes everything that happens. And we, whether we call this Hitler or Nazism or fascism, it's very, very clear that there is an absolute limit beyond which we liberal societies cannot go, even in terms of trying to understand it. And the reason why Arendt is increasingly sidelined is because precisely she tries to understand Nazism. She tries to understand institutional conformity, even when people, or especially when people are doing horrific, horrendous things. It is so much easier for all of us to say, oh, the Nazis were just evil. This doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't tell you anything about them personally or structurally, materially, economically, socially. It doesn't explain like the victim mechanism. It's very obvious that Hitler and others were describing Germany as a victim, right? And this is really important and especially today when victim politics have enormous power.
Ministers for victims.
Well, yes, as to go back to precisely this, but the victim, Judith Schlar makes this point as well. The victim can be extremely cruel. The victim is not protected from his or her own capacity to be evil, and in fact, often it's exacerbated precisely by the idea that they're innocent and therefore they're allowed to do whatever they want. And it's very clear that when Hitler and the other Nazis invoked German punishment at the hands of Versailles, and sought to blame not only Jews but Jewish people especially for sort of conspiratorial operations against Germany, and that Germany needed revenge. And this is a victim mentality that becomes a dangerous, murderous, genocidal machine, right? And to try to understand the way in which bureaucracy functions as protection and exacerbation of that evil and that murderous victimhood, um, sort of image of the world, this vision of the world, um, is precisely what you're not really allowed to do, because if you can't invoke the transcendent evil, which we can't explain, you can't necessarily justify your own politics, particularly when it has things in common with that politics.
So I suppose, but then do you see yourself performing the same move then? You're seeking to critique this transcendent idea of evil, but using the kind of Girard and um, some of these kind of these kind of basic Christian ideas. You're trying to do the same thing, to take away the transcendence of evil, given the kind of the liberal response to it today.
I think politically, yeah. I mean, I think there's a bigger question about evil, which is something like there are just things like, when we talk about Fortuna, or like we can't explain and we can't justify, if you see what I mean. Like there is no explanation for the whole, right? And when anyone tries to give you an explanation for the whole, they're probably not uh thinking critically. And we should be very suspicious about people that try to give us a worldview that explains everything, because there are always holes in knowledge and so on. And so I think at the sort of cosmic level, we could say there is a sense in which certain things will remain necessarily hidden from us and obscure, and we can't explain. And this would include terrible things happening to people who don't deserve it. But on the political level, given that we're talking about what human beings do to each other in relation to particular systems, then I think we can try to attempt perhaps different kinds of solutions, whether we look to a psychological or just consider it for a bit, whether we look to bureaucratic descriptions of what systems do to people, the role of power, the relationship between power and truth, and all of those things. So yeah, I think we should try to understand it. I don't think we should simply put it to one side and say this is no longer a useful question, because it's yeah. But precisely in its attempt to explain it, we then don't make it like a lump of evil. We don't say, oh, there's this thing over here that just exists and we can't explain. It's to unpick that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, to bring this back a bit to hatred and political hatred, a lot of the discussion today about the kind of new culture wars, or just the way of hyper politics, if you want to call it that way, um, it describes it in terms of it being Schmittian, in terms of it being politics devolving into a simple friend-enemy distinction. That's all that there is to it. There are no higher ideals or common interests that we could rally around. It's just my gang versus your gang. And sadly, that seems to be increasingly descriptive of the world. It's not something that I would want to endorse. But one thing that I found interesting, and kind of looking back at Schmitt, is that he makes a distinction between hostis and inimicus. So the kind of public enemy and the private enemy, and the public enemy is something that, in his view, would be the enemy of the state, something that would be combated, whereas the inimicus would be your private enemy, which might have like a more effective element to it. It's someone you hate, your private enemy. And not to buy into kind of Schmidt's vision, not least because of its kind of a defense of the fascist state ultimately. So that's not the purpose here. But it's more that, the description of today's politics as Schmittian founders a little bit on the fact that the public-private distinction has collapsed. And if that collapses, that also means that his own distinction between hostis and inimicus, the public enemy to be combated and the private enemy to be hated, also doesn't work anymore. And so I find that kind of troubling, and maybe to a certain extent explains why we have difficulty with a kind of, I don't know, a kind of productive hatred of the enemy, or whether, because I think, this refers back to I think the question Phil asked you, Nina, about whether, should we indeed hate our enemy? And it strikes me that, I mean, I'm trying to think this through out loud, that the repression of political hatred that there used to be has now kind of foundered. That no longer holds. That we're all kind of encouraged to hate our proximate enemy, whoever it is. The person who drives a pickup truck, or the person who drinks organic tea, whoever it is. You have to hate that enemy. And it seems to me that there's an absence of that maybe politics is too bound up in the hatred of the private enemy, rather than kind of focused on the construction of what we actually want. Maybe that's maybe a very abstract way to put it, but it's not focused on basically on institution building, right? On like, what are the institutions that we want to build for our good society? It's just about hating the enemy, and very often it's kind of a proximate enemy. It's not really the enemy to combat it, the person who's actually really in power, or the structures that sustain that power, but very often just about the person who who consumes the wrong type of product, which is not the side that you're on, the other fan.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I was thinking about Schmidt on the way back home today. It's Yeah, you reminded me of Jean Genet. Jean Genet has this incredible conception of the enemy, where he writes this sort of bizarre text that invokes like Prince Philip or like some crazy royals, and where he starts talking about he wants the declared enemy. Like he wants somebody who says, "I'm your enemy," and he wants to fight to the death with what he just says is the declared enemy. And using that, it's interesting to think about how these supposed enemies are all sort of tacit, they're all implicit. And I think your point about the collapse of the public and the private is so interesting if we think about the therapeutic and the model of the self, and the kind of um, what it means then to accept one's own increasing privacy as one's own potential enemy as well, right? Because this is a very difficult thing for people to cope with, and then you end up in this permanent situation of kind of projection, right? It's not me, even though people are sort of
Externalizing, yeah.
yeah, exactly, sort of projection, externalizing, and reversing what's going, oh no, I'm the victim, like you're the you're the oppressor or the abuser. And this kind of disavowal actually of one's own capacity, which is very unhelpful for thinking about politics as well, because then you end up with people who are completely um, dispossessed of any fight, if you want, or any sense of their own capacity. You just have kind of subjects who are afraid to express anything that might be conceived negatively. And I see this a lot in quite a lot of younger people who are very, very anxious about being thought of as bad people, whatever that means. But this often manifests itself as in just a complete um, reticence about expressing a view or judging or commenting, or and this was sort of happening to students as I left university teaching about 5 years ago. But you could feel it, and I'd been teaching for 13 years, and over that time this reticence had just completely crept in, whether it was people were afraid to say the wrong thing in case someone might film them, someone might tweet about it, whatever. It became stultifying and awful for them as well to feel this level of potential social faux pas judgment. But obviously, unless you make mistakes, you're never going to improve your thinking. Sorry, that's a bit of a tangent, but I think this point about the kind of Schmittianism, yeah, I mean, black and white thinking is easier. It's much easier than
Yeah.
than 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 sort of understanding one's own complicity, one's own, bad behavior or whatever. It does. I don't just mean that in the individual moral level, but I mean structurally as well. The how to disentangle yourself if you can't really. We're in very, very complicated systems. I mean, if you read the great book about risk, the Risk Society. Modernity becomes this endlessly complicated, variegated project about ameliorating risk, but by creating more risk, and you can't conceptualize the extent to which processes even function in relation to one another. And so there's that kind of intrication hatred of the other then seems like a shortcut. That's the problem.
I think, yeah, that's true. Tangling with contradiction is kind of, it's difficult. It's more demanding. Just on the thing about younger people being unable to, feeling they're unable to express themselves. We are going to come back to this because we are going to talk about gender divergences in voting behavior, which is a really wonkish way to put it. But suddenly, across many different countries which are very different from one another, young women are voting for liberal or progressive parties to a much larger degree than young men are, who are increasingly voting for conservative parties. There's a huge amount to unpick, and we're going to be doing that over on the second part of this episode at patreon.com/bunglecast. See you there.